This article is from 2016. I think you'll see the irony in it, and I probably won't read all of it, but I'll read part of it. Legends say China began in a great flood. How ironic. Scientists just found that the flood was real. Of course, this was 2016, so it's a bit dated. It's said the flood looked like endless boiling water surging across the landscape. A wave as tall as a 30-story building would have crashed over the banks of a Yellow River, demolishing everything in its path. It soaked the streets of ancient China's nascent cities and washed away the surrounding farmland. The flood is pouring forth destruction, boundless and overwhelming. It overtops hills and mountains. Goes on a quote attributed to the legendary Emperor Yao. Rising and ever rising, it threatens the very heavens. Well, from their point of view, I'm sure it does seem that way back in those days. If civilization was to survive, the people needed a hero who could tame the floodwaters and restore the land. That man was Yao, founder of China's first dynasty. Of course, over the course of many decades, he organized a dredging campaign, dug channels that would carry water back to its source, and pioneered a tradition of great Chinese public works, and they have always been amazing at it. He brings order out of the chaos and defines the land, separating what would have become the center, or what would become the center of Chinese civilization. He is essentially establishing the political order and the ideologies of rulership in China. It is a powerful foundation myth. But many believe that that was all it was some 4,000 years ago. Yet, some 4,000 years ago, after the flood was supposed to have happened, historians had found no archaeological evidence of its effect on first-hand accounts of its destruction. There are no historical artifacts from that time period or from the dynasty which the emperor founded. All researchers had to go on were stories written long ago after the fact, dramatized and politicized to justify the ends of those who wrote them. Now, why would I be reading this, right? Well, they're trying to make a connection saying this is the oldest flood account, and they've been able to figure this out. And it goes back prior to the story of Noah. Because as everybody knows, Chinese culture is, supreme over all things. And I say that mocking them. Not the Chinese people, but the arrogance of their leadership and the other ridiculousness of their arrogance these days. You would think, being one of the oldest, if not the oldest civilization in history, they'd be, a little more understanding that they should have learned pride is the very thing that brings down your societies. And of course they haven't after thousands of years. The CCP is an example of the epitome of that. So eventually, thousands of years ago, they think, a huge earthquake shook the region, toppling the homes and basically just devastating the country. Now, how all this began is also how it's going to end. And sooner than later. Just telling you. So they looked at children's bones from the site, and they did a lot of research, right? And they found that at the mouth of Gisi Gorge, An avalanche had tumbled into the mouth of it, creating an artificial dam that prevented the river from flowing through. So backed up water had begun to fill the gorge, rising higher and higher and higher each passing month. Well, the people living downstream would have seen the Yellow River slow to a trickle and then eventually stop. Now, it's not clear whether they would have been aware of the disaster that was looming. But 9 months later, the lake spilled over the top of the dam. The blockage came crashing down and the water spilled into the river valley below. Now, they've tried to figure out what that would look like, and using some standard engineering equations, they think they calculated the water would have surged forward at a rate of 300,000 to 500,000 cubic meters per second. The damage, they estimate as well, would have extended as far as 2,000 kilometers, almost 1,250 miles downstream, right? So put this into perspective to our current time. That's roughly the largest flood ever measured on the Amazon River, the world's longest river, or largest river. It's among the largest known floods to ever have happened on Earth during the past 10,000 years. And it's more than 500 times larger than a flood we might expect on the Yellow River from a massive rainfall event. That is, unless there's an earthquake and other series of unfortunate events that blows out the Three Gorges Dam. Then it might rival it. And that's going to happen. So when you look at the devastating flood that occurred back then at the very beginning, right? It's mammoth. It really just leveled what we today know as China. So consider that, right? In terms of what's going on now. And consider that in terms of the prophecies I'm going to read here in a second. In fact, let me just pull it up here. This is from the American Conservative. Let's see here. Here we go. Gotta find it here. 1 second. The Chinese are everything they do is symbolic, right? What in the West, what generally we think of as an alphabet, is for them more symbology, right? So they're very visual, they're very symbolic, everything has a meaning. It's very integrated. It's beautiful in a lot of ways. It's incredible. Everything that the CCP does has a lot of symbolism. And they always telegraph everything they're going to do, or have done, or plan to do, because of it. And the culture itself is very attached to the Chinese zodiac, right? So, this is the year of the rat, right? 2020. So there's some interesting things going on with this. There is a prophecy that ties back. Well, first off, the zodiac, this in terms of this year, the year of the rat, in terms of the Chinese zodiac, predicts great suffering and destruction. So it's a foreboding year. Now, what's interesting when you start looking at this, in terms of COVID and flooding and all kinds of other things, right? It's extremely interesting to see how all these things are kind of coming to pass, right? Now, the CCP is now at war against everybody else that won't bend the knee to them, which is very foolish. So when you look at some of the prophecies that are in their culture, one of them definitively goes back to talking about kind of what's happening right now. And the reality of what's happening right now, they get floods every monsoon season, every year. But this is particularly catastrophic, and it's during COVID, and it's during a great deal of animosity towards the CCP by billions of people and many nations. So when you look at that from the kind of perspective from a biblical point of view, well, I mean, they're essentially reaping what they've sown, not the people. Unfortunately, they're paying the price for the CCP. So the irony is that because of that, you've got this reality of a inherently arrogant and foolish regime that has corrupted and lured into its trap many other leaders, business, governmental, you name it, and their ideology they've tried to quietly puke out around the world and poison nation states as well. Now, here's an interesting thing. It is a corruption of everything that they've integrated. Because what they've done, and they've done a great job, I have to tell you. I mean, they've done an amazing job. You have to give them credit where credit's due. They have brought together the worst of all the other cultures throughout history and built the new China on it. Now, they've corrupted what was good that they got, even though they got it through machinations and intrigues. But when you look at the context of what's happening now, and from a point of view of a cultural reality and the mandate of heaven, they have sown the seeds of their destruction in Beijing. And how they've treated COVID, how they've manipulated people, how they put their hooks into everybody, including all my brothers and sisters on the face of the planet and all the nations, instead of being humble and just, they've been duplicitous and corruptive. And for that reason, I will never support the CCP, and nothing will change for the better for China. It will only get worse for them until the CCP comes out to the world and admits absolutely everything in the entirety of their rulership and history, and admit everything that they've done to everybody else in their duplicity and corruption, and humble themselves and absolutely, totally surrender everything. This is a zero-sum game for them, and it is not a negotiable. And I'm not even going to go back into the rest of their history. Just why the CCP. I'm not going to play their game and what they're planning in everybody else, and how other regimes like the regime in Iran, right, that have blended the worst of religious and political ideologies to form their stuff, and its lawlessness, because they're doomed too. It makes sense they're in bed with Beijing and Beijing's in bed with them. They can all fry and die together. But everything has a cultural, a worldview context, and has a sourcing and a long story behind it. So the CCP itself, I haven't been able to fully vet it because there's flooding that always goes on in Beijing this time of the year to some degree or another. But if it's true, and Tiananmen Square has been flooded, well, that's just the beginning. That should be a sign to the Chinese people of exactly what's coming in increasing measure every month and every year the CCP remains in power. For the whole country. For the leaders around the world and their nations that have bent a knee. For all those that are working together in that. Now, why would I be so harsh about this? Well, if I bring up all the history, you'd understand that. And if I bring up what their choices and their cohort of prostituted systems have done, the corruption that's come from it, the cascade effects from each of those things they've done, you would understand why I hate the CCP. I don't hate the people of China, and I don't even hate the individual people that make up the CCP. I hate their ideology and the CCP being in power. They will be broken, or you will see this entire planet get fucking knocked to the dirt. All of it. Now, you may think I'm crazy, and you're free to do that. But I'll tell you what. You're going to see it with your own eyes. Because there always comes a time in a nation state and in a people when they mock God, when they trample his sanctuary, his people, and they try to counterfeit it and do their own thing. And this is particularly true when they try to rule the whole world. That God renders what is justly due them. First, their destruction and humiliation, and then their eternal damnation. That is precisely what the CCP is staring at. Burning forever. And the only way out of that is total and absolute and complete surrender. And of course, we know they won't do that. They're worried about the United States military and all the militaries around them. Well, that's something to be worried about. In some ways. But they've got bigger problems. And that is heaven itself is against them. Now, it's convenient for them to deny, right, that God exists while wearing the mantle of super spirituality, right, that they borrowed from their own culture and from everybody else to create their myth to remain in power. but everything about them is going to be mocked by the heavens and the earth, and they will be shaken from below and crushed from above. They will be turned on one another and tear each other's flesh off in leadership. Their wealth that they've amassed will amount to dust and ash. Their people will turn against them and devour them for what they've done. They will be captured alive and utterly annihilated. As will all of those who bent a knee to them and sold their souls. And that includes the ones that bought into a lie of any other kind that's derivative from them or any other false ideology, fakery, lawlessness. You're all going to burn together. And you can say whatever you want. I'm not here for a popularity contest. I really don't care. I hate your fucking world. I love the world that God created, not the facsimile of it. You've, destroyed it and destroyed his creation to try to create. I despise that. If you want to come kill me, you're more than welcome. I'll give you the geolocation points. If you think you can do that, come on. But I'll tell you what, it isn't going to stop your fate. In fact, it's probably only going to exponentially increase the speed of your ultimate fate. So if Tiananmen Square is flooded or has been flooded, that's where your fake god Mao has his mausoleum with his rotting carcass still sitting in it. Right? The Forbidden City, the Emperor's Palace, right? And the Temple of Heaven. Well, you are going to get what you always say. As above, so below. You were kicked out of there, and you'll never go back, and you will be kicked off the earth and into hell. That's where your fate is. You will lose not only the temporary, but the eternal. And what you've done to the planet, what you've done to people, what you do to your own people, and what you're responsible for at this present moment, at this age, in this time, has brought about the end of that age and the end of your rule of any sort, and all of the kingdoms that were derivative from you throughout all of time and space and human history. And you will be absolutely devastated and crushed and shown zero mercy, just the way you did to everyone else. Every time I think of them, every time I think of all that you're responsible for in Beijing and Tehran and all the other capitals and high places in the world that colluded together to actually whore out their peoples and their nations to you, I burn on the inside like 10,000 suns with rage towards you. So if you be God, prove it. The heavens would like to see you prove your godhood status, Beijing. You atheist pieces of shit. Prove it. Or prepare to die and have your kingdoms crushed. Because that's what's going to happen. I have never in my life ever hated anybody or anything except stuff that's evil, starting with my own flesh and my own mistakes. And if I don't put up with pride in my own life, and I hate it when I see it in my own life, what makes you think I'm going to think any differently about your regime in Beijing or your false two-headed prophets in all your other systems like Tehran and that convoluted mess of lies? Now, you will all march yourselves into the same place where all your cultures came from, and that is the cradle of civilization, and it will become the crypt of your end. That is your fate. And once that occurs and you are absolutely annihilated and devastated there, you will burn for 1,000 eternities, and that will be but a grain of sand in what you have facing you. You will never, ever, ever rise again. That is what you have looking at you. And you're not fighting what you think you're fighting. You're fighting the armies of heaven itself, which you cannot see, you blind bunch of bastard fools. And you're also fighting against creation itself, which is going to crush you from below by shaking you as you're getting crushed from above by the armies of heaven. Now you know. So to hell with you. May the Lord God Almighty rebuke you, break you, humiliate you, and remove you from the face of creation for eternity.